Hello, Social Studies 10. Today we're going to learn about World War II on the Eastern Front in Europe. So in Russia, they call this conflict the Great Patriotic War, and it's the bloodiest war ever fought in Europe. This part of World War II was much different than the Western Front. Rather than just a battle between different countries, the war was fought between races and political ideologies rather than just between countries. It was a war of annihilation and destruction, which is why it became the bloodiest war in Europe. This war was fought at great cost by all the countries involved, especially the Soviet Union, which lost approximately 12 million civilians and 10 million soldiers in the war, which is 14% of its population. And total double the population of Canada at the time. So an amazingly high death toll, and it seems to have been going up in recent years. Um, Perhaps people are finding more mass graves or statistics on the population reductions in the Western Soviet Union have been updated. Nazi Germany lost around 5 million soldiers and 1.5 million civilian casualties during this conflict, but also including deaths from Allied strategic bombing. So that's about 10% of of Germany's population. So why did this conflict happen? So you might remember that the Soviet Union and Germany had a non-aggression pact, and they had participated together to partition Poland in two and split up different countries in Eastern Europe. And this invasion appears to be one of Hitler's biggest mistakes. So Hitler felt compelled to invade the Soviet Union due to his racial ideology. So he saw the Slavic people, such as Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, and Belarusians, as kind of the lowest human race that needed to be enslaved. Also, he needed Lebensraum, which means living room. So this is what Hitler said: "We'll take away its character of an Asiatic steppe. We'll Europeanize it. There's only one duty: to Germanize this country by the immigration of Germans, and to look upon the natives as redskins." So he's comparing what he needs to do in the Soviet Union to what the United States did to Native Americans, which was um, a massive campaign of displacement and extermination. So the Soviet Union's military looked quite weak at the time. Despite the fact it was a massive military, they had a lot of trouble facing Finland, which I think had 6 million people total, during the Winter War. Um, a lot of the top Red Army generals had been killed in Stalin's purges, so Soviet Union was looking ripe for the pickings. And it appeared that they were. Germany invaded on June 22nd, 1941, and the Soviet Union was completely off guard. This was despite the fact that the US and Britain, especially Britain, had sent intelligence that Germany was planning to invade with evidence, but Stalin thought this was a trap to lure him into the war on Britain's side. One of the reasons why the invasion happened in June rather than earlier in the spring was that um, Germany's army was diverted south to fight Yugoslavia and Greece due to Italy's failed invasion of Greece. So Stalin, who was completely unprepared for this invasion and didn't think Germany was going to invade, the only person he ever seemed to trust was Hitler, who is one of history's least trustable leaders. Uh, It's kind of strange. And so Stalin suffered a nervous breakdown and disappeared for a few weeks. Most public announcements were made by his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. The Soviet armies completely collapsed. Um, about 4 million soldiers were captured in the giant German encirclement maneuver. So this was Germany's Blitzkrieg at its peak, cutting through the enemy lines and making these giant circles. You can see here some of these big pockets, and they would be capturing hundreds of thousands of soldiers in one go. It was, in the history of warfare, it was completely devastating and almost unprecedented. So many people in the Western Soviet Union viewed the Germans as liberators, such as in the Baltic countries, which had recently been invaded by the Soviet Union, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and also in the Ukraine. This was because the Soviets had uh, purged many of the elites of these countries. They had caused massive famine and death. So the people thought that the Nazis would be better rulers than Stalin. Germany was helped in this invasion by many countries of the Axis, such as Romania, Hungary, Finland, Slovakia, Croatia. Bulgaria sent not much support, a bit, as well as other European volunteers such as Spanish Condor Legion. So Germany's Blitzkrieg was extremely successful. They gained 200 miles in less than a month, which, considering the size of both the armies, is quite incredible. As the Soviets retreated, they practiced scorched earth. So they burned farms, destroyed factories, flooded mines, chewed up their own railroads as they retreated. This is so that the Germans would not be able to take much from the land and would not be able to advance as quickly. And it's kind of repeating the similar strategy that Russia used when Napoleon invaded 130 years before this. The Soviets managed to disassemble many of their factories in European Russia and move them east of the Ural Mountains into Siberia, where they were out of bombing range. This was a massive feat. So, the Battle of Moscow. The Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow on October 10th, 1941. German patrols could see the Kremlin through the binoculars. However, things started to get cold around this time. We can see or estimate that the weather here is about the same as the weather in Saskatchewan. Um, so Hitler had studied Napoleon's invasion of Russia, but had decided the problem with Napoleon was that he was too slow, and Hitler didn't even produce winter clothing for his soldiers because he decided that they would be over and done with the battle and then could come home before winter. Um, and so he didn't want to send winter equipment to the soldiers because he wanted to encourage it to get over and done with. So this was had a terrible effect for German soldiers who started freezing, dying of frostbite. German tanks and airplanes stopped working as temperatures slipped below zero, and also before they went below zero, Germany had a lot of trouble with the autumn mud season. Soviet Marshal Zhukov managed to successfully defend Moscow. He was recalled from Siberia after the Soviet Union reached a non-aggression pact with Japan. And so by early December, it was clear that Germany would not be able to take Moscow, and Zhukov began counterattacking. This is the failure of Operation Barbarossa, but not of the entire German invasion of the Soviet Union. While the Battle of Moscow was going on, the second largest city in the Soviet Union, Leningrad, known before and now as St. Petersburg, fell under siege. So the Finns cut off Leningrad from the north, and the Germans cut it off from the south and southeast. Because of its name, Hitler decided to starve the city out instead of taking it by force. Also, Germany's lines were quite stretched, so they may not have been able to take it very easily by force. But Hitler wanted the people to pay because the city was named after Lenin, the communist founder of the Soviet Union. Um, as well, the Finns had achieved their strategic goals and refused to advance any further. Finland was kind of an anomaly in the Axis, is that they still maintain a semi-democratic government and weren't interested in things like massive executions of civilians or objectives beyond what they saw as Greater Finland. So the people of the city began to starve. Um, because the Soviet Union was a communist country, things were already very centrally planned. So government-run bakeries began to um, run out of supplies. So during the winter, each citizen was given only 125 grams of bread per day, and they were cutting the bread with up to 50% sawdust. People began eating their pets. Then they began boiling all their leather boots and leather belts, any leather clothes, and eating the boiled leather. And there's even reports of cannibalism. Finally, during the winter, Lake Ladoga, to the east of Leningrad, froze over. The Soviets managed to bring a few supplies over the frozen lake. And the siege was not lifted until January 27, 1944, so making it one of the longest sieges in history, um, and an extremely costly siege. Over 1 million civilians and 1 million Soviet soldiers died in the siege. Racial warfare. So as I said before, the battle on the Eastern Front was a war of extermination. Germany used brigades called the Einsatzgruppen to find and kill Jewish people and Communist Party members. As the German army was advancing, the Einsatzgruppen went behind the front lines and caused massive executions. Often they would force the victims to dig their own graves and then shoot them into them. Local collaborators would often help find the Nazis or help the Nazis find and kill Jewish people. So often, because they were Germans, they were from outside, they didn't know who was Jewish and who wasn't. So the locals would be like, "Oh, it's that guy," and help the Nazis kill them, and then maybe take their stuff afterwards. However, life for the locals often began to turn bad, especially for the Slavic inhabitants of the Western USSR in Ukraine and Belarus and Western Russia. They were deprived of healthcare, education, and basic services because the Germans wanted to reduce their numbers to prepare for colonization of German people. They had the rule of one-third. So the Nazis said one-third needed to be killed, one-third needed to be exiled east of the Ural Mountains to Asia, and one-third needed to be used as slaves. This was extremely cruel. And by depriving them of education, this would deprive them of their identity and ability to organize and fight back. So 60% of the Soviet prisoners of war died in German prisoners of war camps or in gas chambers. 7 million Soviet civilians were victims of genocide. So that means they were killed because of their race or ethnicity or religion. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed Belarusians and Ukrainians were spared for future use as slaves. Because of this extremely harsh treatment, many civilians fled to the forest to join escaped prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, to form partisan groups, which used guerrilla warfare to fight the Nazis behind the front lines uh, in small raiding parties, often cutting Nazi supplies, and this became a huge problem for the Germans in the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad. So here's a map of the 1942 summer offensive. The initial push is called Fall Blau, or Operation Blue. Initial push was here, then the further push, and the goal was to take the oil in the Caucasus. This is a very oil-rich region. Germany was starved for oil at this time. The Battle of Stalingrad was here. Stalingrad was on the Volga River, which was an important supply route, but it wasn't like a first level city in the Soviet Union. So it started in late August 1942, and this was the farthest East German advance. Hitler was obsessed with taking Stalingrad. He wanted to destroy it. The city was named after his enemy Stalin, and it had to be crushed. And Stalin was obsessed with defending it. City was named after himself, and of course it would be too much of a blow for his prestige and maybe the country's prestige to lose it. So each country threw everything they could into this battle, even though the city only had moderate strategic value. Every house, every factory was fought over. At one point, Germany had almost complete control of the city. Um, However, I'll go back to the map. The Soviets saw that the flanks guarding the sides of the city were Hungarian, Italian, and Romanian troops who were less motivated and less well equipped. So they decided that they would um, poke holes and do a kind of a similar strategy to Blitzkrieg. It's called deep operations, and surround Stalingrad. And this operation was quite successful. So the Germans were caught in a kind of a counter-encirclement siege. This lasted for many months. The German Luftwaffe commander, the Air Force commander, Hermann Göring, said, "Don't worry, I'll supply the city from air. We'll drop enough ammunition and food to keep the soldiers sustained." But this was a bunch of bluster, and it failed, and the German soldiers were starving and were very low on ammunition. So eventually, in February, the commander, Field Marshal von Paulus, surrendered to the Soviet Union. The prisoners of war were taken away, many to Siberia, and most were never seen again. Battle of Kursk. So Soviets started a counterattack that would continue right to Berlin. The Germans tried one final large battle to stop this counterattack, and that is the Battle of Kursk. It's the largest tank battle in history. Germany had some new tanks to use, such as the Panther and the Tiger, and this offensive was in the spring of 1943. Uh, the Germans wanted to encircle the Soviet army because the Soviet army had a big bulge, and the Germans wanted to pinch that bulge. However, the Soviet intelligence learned about this, and they used a defense and death tactic to make many defensive lines with tank ditches, anti-tank guns, landmines, all sorts of defense to guard against the eventual pincher attacks. And the Germans were very successful. They made it through every line to the very last defensive line, which held. And so they were not successful in the end. And it turned out to be a crushing victory because many of their tanks were destroyed. And from then on, it was basically straight back. By the end of 1944, the entirety of Soviet territory was liberated. Parts of Eastern Germany were occupied by the Soviet Union. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary had all surrendered. And here's some pictures of the Soviet War Memorial in Moscow. So you can see it's a very tall building. This is a painting of the two Soviet armies that encircled Stalingrad, meeting each other. It's Operation Uranus. Here is a memorial in that museum. Another memorial. This is kind of an interesting. This was the Russian or the Soviet take on Operation Barbarossa, where they're essentially blaming the West instead of taking any responsibility for being unprepared of a Nazi attack. Uh, these are scenes from the Battle of Berlin, which I'll talk about in a later lesson, recreated scenes. Here's the eternal flame outside of the Kremlin to remember World War II, and these are the names of some of the battles. That is my show.